Thank you very much, Acting Deputy President. This is an important opportunity for the Chamber to consider a housing policy of the government. This is a housing policy that, in the government for vested interests, of course, is designed to send more and more taxpayer funds to the people who need it the least, and that is the major donors and benefactors to the Labor Party. And in particular, I want to single out the super funds, because they, of course, will be part of, they'll be one of the major beneficiaries of this scheme. Now, the reason I call the government for vested interests is because it is only able to get out of bed every day if it has something that it really wants to do for the unions or the big super funds. The idea that it's working for the typical worker is absolutely laughable, and every day we see the same old laundry list of issues: pattern bargaining, the abolition of labour hire, the covering up of payments from super funds to unions, the transferring of more taxpayer support to super funds so they can own all the houses in Australia and then people can rent them back like serfs. I mean, basically, every single policy of the government is infected with this disease. And when you go into the street in any town or city in Australia, I think you'll find that people are worried about mortgage costs, they're worried about rent costs. And I think the idea that the government's priority to legislate the objective of superannuation is a good example of the government for vested interests, because it is a twisted agenda. When you only see things through the commercial prism of your major donors and benefactors, that you act in this way. And so this bill is another example of this twisted approach to governing. It's not a government for all Australians, it's a government for vested interests. And in relation to these matters, these are serious matters. I think the Darryl Kerrigan equation here is very apt and very good. And of course we want to see Australians be able to access a home. It is a key determinant as to whether or not a person will have a successful retirement. The reality is, if you are a retired renter, you are going to have a more difficult retirement. And so finding ways for people to get into the first home market is important. It's also important that we do find ways to support renters. There are a lot of renters in Australia and many people are happy renting, and so we should have policies for prospective home buyers. We should have policies for home owners, even when the bank owns most of their home, and we should have policies to support renters. Now, in relation to the housing problem we have, people are aware of the major problem the country has, which is a problem of supply. There have been many inquiries, many investigations. There have been many economic assessments done. And it does come down to supply. And supply is particularly problematic when you are running a large migration program. Now, we have always competed for people and for capital, and I hope that we always will. And I hope that we will always be a country that supports migration. But we need to be a country that builds houses. And the most recent parliamentary inquiry, which did a deep dive, to use that dreadful Americanism, into housing, was the House Tax and Revenue Committee in the last parliament, which was chaired by Mr Jason Falinski. And that recommended some quite clean and clear measures that could be adopted by governments. Recommendation 3 of that committee was that the committee recommends that the Australian government should institute a grant scheme that pays states and localities for delivering more housing supply and affordable housing. That's quite a good recommendation. Now, the Centre for Independent Studies has done some further investigation of these type of schemes and has looked into parts of the United States where there are incentives for localities which release more supply, release more land, and also consider more dense housing. Now, I understand the problem of NIMBYism. It is very politically difficult for some people, but there are parts of our cities where more density is going to be essential if we are to meet the supply needs, because we are a highly urbanised population. Sure, there are many Australians who live in the bush and the regions, and I grew up in a regional community myself, but most Australians live in cities, and our cities are too spread out, and the scourge of NIMBYism is, I have to say, alive and well. And it is a bipartisan problem. It is a wretched problem, and I believe that the national government is perhaps the only institution capable of solving it. And I say that because I think that the national government can incentivise the states and local governments to act in the interests of the ratepayers and the taxpayers, who ultimately will need to see more dwellings built and for there to be more density. And that is a central model of the Falinski inquiry from just a couple of years ago. Now, that inquiry cited the precedent of the National Competition Policy, which made payments to states for doing the right thing when it came to competition policy. Now, we're a federalist party, a Liberal party, and states have different approaches, and we respect that. Some states have more competitive, more dynamic economies. Others have a greater concentration of state-owned enterprises, and that is something that those individuals who live in those states can make a judgment about whether they come or whether they leave. And I think ultimately this is where we will get to on housing, that states and localities which fail to deliver on housing will be less attractive places to live. And so that is a wretched problem on the supply side. Now, on the demand side, I referenced this in my opening comments, that the government wants to enact this housing policy to provide tax incentives to super funds. Now, the President of the Labor Party, who's also the chairman of a big super fund, Mr Swan, announced late last year, that the CBUS super fund would give $500 million of the members' money to the HAF scheme. And according to documents released under Freedom of Information, we discovered that whilst Mr Swan was promising $500 million of members' money, the CBUS fund was providing submissions to the Treasury Department saying that the design of the HAF scheme was fundamentally flawed and was not appropriate for long-term investors. So this illustrates the massive conflict with the Labor Party's policy development, that their policies are not designed for people, they're designed for major institutions. And the CBUS example, I think, is a very fine example. Of course, CBUS transfers $3 or $4 million each and every year through to the CFMEU through inflated directors' fees, and these figures are known because of AEC disclosures, Electoral Commission disclosures. So this is a major conflict, I believe, here, and it has been illustrated in this bill. Now, why would funds which already receive compulsorily $100 billion a year in mandatory contributions need further tax breaks? I mean, are we seriously saying that we want to have a system where super funds which already receive over $100 billion a year in compulsory contributions need more of our money? More money through tax incentives? And then the scheme, of course, is build to rent. So the funds would then own all the houses, and then they would rent the houses or apartments or flats back to people. So you have a system where you totally overturn the notion of people owning a home. The super fund has your money because the government passed a law that says that you're not allowed to have all your money. It's got to go off to a super fund so they can charge high fees on it and they can send money off to banks and unions. And then separately, they're also going to own your house. So we're living in a world that maybe Superman would have recognised, LexCorp or something, where basically 4 or 5 major super funds have all your money and they have your house. So I think the facilitation of this idea is a very dangerous idea. And the Cbus example, I think, is pertinent to the discussion. I mean, why would the chairman of the fund, who's also the chairman of the Labor Party, be rushing out of the gates to commit $500 million of the members' money, whilst we know behind the scenes they had major reservations about the scheme's design? I mean, the FOI documents document in detail that the Cbus fund thought that it wasn't a good idea to design it this way. So we are where we are. The government wants to proceed with this particular bill after a protracted negotiation, as is their right, and this bill will do very little for first home buyers because first home buyers are facing a structural problem here, particularly millennials and Zoomers, that it is harder than ever to gather a deposit. And of course, 10 or 11% of people's money now is being sent off to these super funds, back to the super funds again, and therefore the task of pulling together a deposit is so much harder as a result. Now, any honest economist would say that turning that around is not on its own an entirely credible solution. It will definitely help some people if they can use their own money to buy a home. It won't be a silver bullet. You'll still need to deal with the supply issue. And the key policy solution that has been recommended by recent inquiries is that the Commonwealth would look to incentivise the states and local governments to release more land, to provide more density, because ultimately that is the supply which is needed. I certainly understand that there is a need and have always supported the role that social housing plays in our society. But most Australians have aspiration to own their own home, and the long-running structural problem we now have is that millennials and Gen Zs are very unlikely, in some cases, to ever get access to a first home. And that has a cascading set of problems for that generation as they get older, because the way that the tax and the social security systems work in this country, if you don't own a house and you are in retirement, you are going to have a much more difficult time than you otherwise would. So therefore, the key point here is that we should be doing everything we can to promote first home ownership, not ownership of all the houses by big super funds, but by the people, because I think everyone agrees that Daryl Kerrigan was absolutely accurate when he described a house as more than a home, and that is why we've always believed in home ownership, because it has more than just a financial benefit. But the financial benefit can never be underestimated, all the while we have a tax and social security system which discriminates in favour of homeowners. That is the reality. And so by giving up on a housing policy, which is what this bill does, we are giving up, or the government has decided to give up on millennials and Gen Zs, and is saying to them, forget about ever having a house. The best we can do for you is to get the super fund to own your house and then rent it back to you like you're a serf. So I think it's a very disappointing outcome and we'll be voting against this bill.